Sir, I need you to stop touching the window. Emily Carter's voice carried the thin edge of exhaustion that came from working a packed overnight flight 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. The old man in seat 16A didn't answer right away. He simply kept his weathered hand resting lightly against the glass as the dark clouds outside flickered silver with distant lightning. Around him, the cabin hummed with the restless noise of modern travel. Phone screens glowed blue in tired faces. Ice rattled softly inside plastic cups. Somewhere near row 23, a baby cried for the third time in an hour. But the old man seemed untouched by any of it. He sat perfectly still in his faded olive jacket, his pale blue eyes fixed on the empty night sky beyond the wing. Emily exhaled slowly. She had dealt with nervous flyers, angry businessmen, and drunk tourists before. Old men who stared into thunderstorms like they recognized them were new. Sir, she repeated, FAA regulations. You need to remain seated and keep the shade down during turbulence. The aircraft jolted hard enough to shake the overhead bins. A few passengers gasped. The old man finally turned his head toward her. His face looked carved by time itself, lined deep around the eyes and jaw, the kind of face that belonged in old military photographs framed in dusty hallways. They're early, he said quietly. Emily blinked. Excuse me. The old man glanced back toward the clouds. Storm shifted east about 20 miles. His voice was low and rough, like gravel under heavy boots. Fast movers will reroute through this corridor. Emily stared at him for half a second before forcing a polite smile. Great. Another aviation conspiracy guy. Across the aisle, a college kid wearing noise-canceling headphones snorted without looking up from his phone. Dude thinks he's in Top Gun. A few nearby passengers chuckled quietly. The old man didn't react. He simply adjusted the old leather strap of a worn duffel bag resting beneath his feet. Emily noticed something strange then. The bag looked ancient. Dark brown leather faded nearly gray at the edges, scarred with scratches and oil stains that no amount of cleaning could remove. A small patch was stitched near the zipper. Black thread. Circular design. Almost military, but too faded to recognize. Sir, are you military? She asked before she could stop herself. The old man's eyes shifted toward her again. Calm. Unreadable. Used to fly. Another ripple of laughter came from across the aisle. Yeah, and my grandpa stormed the beaches at Normandy, the college kid muttered. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft pushed deeper into the storm front. Rain streaked hard against the windows now, thin silver lines racing backward across the glass. Then something changed. Emily felt it immediately. Not turbulence. Not weather. The sound. Deep beneath the steady roar of the Boeing's engines came another vibration. Distant. Sharp. Fast. The old man lifted his eyes before anyone else noticed it. There they are, he whispered. 30 seconds later, the captain's voice suddenly cracked across the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just received an unexpected military traffic advisory. Please remain seated while we coordinate a temporary course adjustment. The cabin fell quiet. Even the college kid lowered his phone. Then, through the storm outside, two thin gray shadows tore across the clouds beside the aircraft like ghosts moving through moonlight. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Fighter jets. The old man in seat 16A never looked surprised. He only stared into the darkness with the expression of someone watching old memories return from very far away. The two fighter jets vanished back into the storm almost as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only a fading tremor that rolled through the body of the aircraft like distant thunder. The cabin remained unnaturally quiet. People stared at the windows now instead of their phones. Even the crying baby had stopped. Emily Carter steadied herself against the galley wall as the Boeing shuddered lightly beneath another pocket of rough air. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice returned over the speakers, tighter this time. We are coordinating with nearby military traffic due to restricted airspace activity. There is no danger to the aircraft. Nobody believed the last part. Emily could hear it in the silence. Fear had a sound. It was the absence of movement, the stillness of strangers waiting for someone else to panic first. Across the aisle, the college kid slowly pulled off his headphones. Why would fighters be this close to a civilian route? He asked nobody in particular. An older businessman answered without looking up from his armrest. Because something went wrong. The old man in seat 16A remained perfectly calm. He sat with both hands folded over the top of his cane now, eyes fixed on the dim cloud cover outside. The blue cabin lights reflected softly across the deep lines of his face. Emily watched him carefully. Something about him no longer felt ordinary. It was not just the way he had predicted the jets. It was the stillness. Everyone else on the plane reacted like passengers. He reacted like someone who had been here before. Another sharp vibration rolled through the cabin. A warning chime sounded overhead. This time several passengers gasped openly. A flight attendant near the rear galley stumbled and caught herself against the beverage cart. Then the overhead screens flickered. Once. Twice. Gone. The cabin lights dimmed for half a second before emergency backup power stabilized them again in a dull, amber glow. A low murmur spread instantly across the rows. Emily's stomach tightened. Electrical interruptions at 30,000 feet were never good. The intercom crackled again, but instead of the captain, a strained voice filled the cabin. Cabin crew to stations immediately. Emily grabbed the nearest jump seat phone automatically. Forward cabin here. The answer came fast and clipped through static. Cockpit lost secondary navigation for approximately 12 seconds. We are attempting reroute confirmation now. Emily felt cold crawl slowly down her spine. Outside the windows, lightning flashed across the clouds in pale white veins. Then she noticed movement beside her. The old man had unbuckled his seatbelt. "Sir," Emily snapped immediately. "You need to remain seated." He ignored her. Not rudely. Not defiantly. He simply stood with the careful steadiness of someone much younger than his age should have allowed. Around him, passengers turned instinctively. The old leather duffel bag hung at his side now. The faded circular patch caught the dim amber light for just a moment. Emily could finally see part of the stitching clearly. A black ring surrounding a silver shape almost worn away by time. "Wings." "Sir," she repeated more firmly, stepping into the aisle. "You cannot be up right now." The old man looked toward the cockpit door. Somewhere ahead, hidden behind reinforced steel and flickering instrument panels, she could hear raised voices for the first time. Short, controlled, professional, but strained. The old man tilted his head slightly, listening. Not to the passengers, not to the storm, to the aircraft itself. Then he said something that made the blood drain from Emily's face. "Your captain just lost inertial cross-check." She stared at him. "How would you even know that?" The old man's pale blue eyes shifted toward her with quiet exhaustion. "Because I have heard that sound before." Then, from somewhere beyond the storm outside, another deep roar passed through the clouds, closer this time than before. The second pass shook the aircraft harder than the first. A deep metallic vibration rolled through the cabin floor, low and fast, like the sky itself had cracked open beside them. Several passengers cried out. Plastic cups tipped across tray tables. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a woman began praying under her breath. Emily Carter grabbed the overhead seat backs to steady herself as the Boeing dipped slightly left before correcting again. Outside the windows, the storm clouds churned in pale gray spirals lit by flashes of lightning. Then came the sound again. Closer now. Faster. The old man standing in the aisle tilted his head almost imperceptibly, listening to the roar beyond the fuselage. "They are not shadowing us anymore," he said quietly. Emily stared at him. "What does that mean?" Before he could answer, the cockpit door burst open. First Officer Daniel Reeves stepped into the cabin, his face tight with controlled panic. He looked younger than Emily remembered, barely mid-30s, but right now the strain around. His eyes made him look 10 years older. "Emily," he said quickly, keeping his voice low, "we need all passengers seated immediately." Then his eyes landed on the old man. Irritation flashed across his face instantly. "Sir, you need to sit down now." The old man did not move. "You lost backup alignment again," he said calmly. Reeves froze for half a second. Emily noticed it immediately. "How did you know that?" the pilot asked sharply. The old man's eyes shifted toward the cockpit. "Your starboard correction came 3 seconds late." Reeves stared at him like he had just spoken another language. Behind him, another warning tone echoed faintly from the flight deck. "Short. Urgent." The pilot's jaw tightened. "Sir, unless you are secretly flying this aircraft from seat 16, I suggest you sit down." A few nearby passengers chuckled nervously, desperate for normalcy. The old man ignored them completely. Instead, He looked past Reeves toward the cockpit instruments beyond the partially open door. You are drifting north. Reeves took one step forward, frustration finally breaking through his professional mask. Okay, enough. I do not know who you think you are, but this is not helping. The old man slowly reached into the pocket of his faded olive jacket. Instantly, Reeves stiffened. Emily felt the entire row tense. But all the old man pulled out was a small pair of wireframe reading glasses attached to a cracked leather cord. He unfolded them carefully and glanced toward the storm outside again. They are trying to intercept your vector before you enter restricted airspace. Reeves opened his mouth to argue again, but the overhead speakers crackled violently before cutting him off. Cockpit alert. Military advisory update. Immediate heading confirmation required. Static swallowed the rest. The first officer's expression changed instantly. Not fear exactly. Worse. Uncertainty. The kind that trained professionals hated most. He turned toward the cockpit, then hesitated. His eyes drifted back to the old man. How do you know any of this? The old man looked tired suddenly. Older than before. Like every engine vibration carried memories nobody else aboard could hear. Because 30 years ago, he said softly, I flew through the exact same storm corridor. Lightning flashed outside, flooding the cabin in white light for half a heartbeat. And in that instant, Emily noticed something she had missed before. Embroidered into the faded patch on the old leather duffel bag were tiny silver letters nearly erased by time. GS6. Reeves noticed them too. His expression shifted subtly. Confusion first, then recognition trying to form around something impossible. Before he could speak, the aircraft jolted violently again. A sharp burst of static exploded from the cockpit speakers. Then a new voice cut through the noise. Calm. Military. Controlled. Unidentified civilian aircraft. This is Falcon Lead. You are entering restricted training airspace. Respond immediately. The cabin went dead silent. The old man closed his eyes for just a moment when he heard the voice. The voice coming through the cockpit speakers carried the cold precision of military training, clipped and emotionless beneath the layer of radio static. Civilian aircraft, respond immediately and verify heading. Every passenger on the plane seemed to stop breathing at once. The only sound left inside the cabin was the low growl of engines pushing through heavy storm clouds at 30,000 feet. First Officer Daniel Reeves turned sharply toward the cockpit. Sweat glistened faintly along his temple, now despite the cool recycled air. Emily Carter could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Procedures. Checklists. Emergency coordination. Everything drilled into him over thousands of flight hours. But underneath it all was something else. He was losing certainty, and pilots hated uncertainty more than turbulence. The old man, standing near seat 16, remained motionless, pale blue eyes fixed ahead, listening, not to the passengers, not to the panic slowly spreading through the cabin, listening to the radio frequencies buried beneath the static like old music returning through the years. Sir, Reeves said more carefully this time, do you recognize that call sign? The old man did not answer immediately. Outside the windows, lightning flashed again, illuminating the clouds in violent white layers. For half a second, the entire cabin looked frozen inside a photograph. Then darkness returned. Falcon Squadron, the old man said quietly. Fighter wing out of Langley. Reeves stared at him. How would you know that? The old man's weathered hand tightened slightly around the handle of his cane. Because they still use the same vector cadence. Another burst of static crackled overhead. Civilian aircraft, respond immediately. You are approaching restricted military corridor. This time there was urgency beneath the controlled tone. Emily glanced toward the windows. A shape moved through the clouds again. Sleek. Fast. Close enough now that she could briefly make out the angled silhouette of an F-35 slicing through the storm beside them before vanishing back into gray darkness. A nervous ripple spread through the passengers. The college kid across the aisle raised his phone with trembling hands, trying to record through the glass. This is insane, he whispered. The old man's eyes shifted toward the phone for only a second. Put that away. The young man scoffed nervously. Why? The answer came softly. Because military pilots do not like cameras when something is wrong. The words settled heavily into the cabin. Reeves looked toward the old leather duffel bag again. His eyes narrowed on the faded patch stitched near the zipper. GS6. Something deep in his memory stirred. Flight school. Military coordination seminars. Stories older pilots told after too much coffee and too little sleep. Ghost 6. No. Impossible. Reeves shook the thought away immediately. The cockpit speakers crackled violently again. This time the captain's voice cut through the static, tense and controlled. Daniel, get back in here now. Reeves turned fast toward the cockpit, but hesitated once more. His eyes drifted back toward the old man, standing calmly in the aisle, while everyone else aboard fought rising panic. Who are you? He asked quietly. The old man looked tired suddenly. Not weak, just burdened. Like every sound coming through those radio frequencies carried ghosts attached to them. Before he could answer, the plane lurched sharply sideways. Gasps erupted across the cabin. Overhead bins rattled hard enough to pop, one partially open, near row 21. The lights flickered again. Emily grabbed a seat back as the Boeing corrected itself with a long mechanical groan. Somewhere ahead, warning alarms chirped rapidly inside the cockpit. Then came another voice over the emergency channel. Younger this time. Tighter. Falcon lead to civilian aircraft. Your transponder drift is increasing. Correct heading immediately. The old man closed his eyes. And for the first time since Emily had met him, emotion crossed his face. Not fear. Recognition. Deep and old. His fingers brushed lightly across the faded patch on the duffel bag. The touch pulled him somewhere far away from the storm and the frightened passengers and the shaking cabin. Suddenly, he was no longer standing beneath amber cabin lights. He was 28 years old again inside a dark cockpit lit only by green instrument glow. Rain hammered against reinforced glass. Engines screamed through midnight clouds over the Persian Gulf. A younger voice crackled through his headset. Panicked. Ghost 6, we lost navigation lock. Another voice followed immediately after. Missile warning radar is blind. We cannot hold formation. His hands gripped the controls tighter as lightning flashed across black skies outside. Then the memory shattered as the Boeing jolted violently once more, dragging him back into the present. The old man opened his eyes slowly. The storm outside reflected in them like old fire. The aircraft dropped suddenly through a pocket of violent air, hard enough to tear a scream from somewhere near the rear cabin. Oxygen masks did not fall, but several passengers grabbed for them anyway, panic finally overwhelming restraint. The overhead lights flickered amber against terrified faces while the storm outside churned like black ocean waves around the aircraft. Emily Carter braced herself against the bulkhead near the cockpit entrance, her pulse hammering in her ears. Inside the flight deck, warning tones continued chirping in sharp bursts beneath the strained voices of the pilots. The old man stood perfectly still through all of it, his cane planted firmly against the trembling cabin floor. His pale blue eyes never left the cockpit door. First Officer Daniel Reeves looked caught between frustration and disbelief now. Every instinct told him to force the old man back into his seat. But another instinct, older and quieter, kept stopping him. Pilots learned to trust strange feelings in the air. Sometimes they kept you alive. Sir, Reeves said carefully. If you know something, now would be a very good time to explain it. The old man's gaze shifted slowly toward him. Your inertial reference system is desynchronizing from the storm interference. Reeves blinked. How could you possibly know that? Because your left correction keeps lagging behind your right by half a second. The first officer stared at him in complete silence. Emily saw it happen again. That tiny fracture in confidence. The moment a trained professional realized someone else in the room understood the problem better than he did. Another burst of static exploded through the cockpit speaker overhead. Civilian aircraft, this is Falcon Lead. You are now inside active military corridor. Correct heading immediately. The younger fighter pilot sounded tense now. Less formal. More urgent. The old man closed his eyes briefly when he heard the voice. Almost like he recognized not the pilot, but the fear beneath the professionalism. Then he opened them again and looked directly at Reeves. Your captain is trying to compensate manually. Reeves did not answer because it was true. Emily could see it on his face instantly. How do you know that? Reeves whispered. The old man gave a tired exhale. Because autopilot corrections stopped 15 seconds ago. For the first time since the emergency began, the first officer looked genuinely shaken. A sharp alarm sounded again inside the cockpit. Then the captain's strained voice called out from behind the reinforced door. Daniel, I need another heading source now. Reeves turned immediately toward the cockpit, but the old man spoke again before he could move. Guard frequency. Reeves stopped. What? Open military emergency frequency. The first officer frowned. That is restricted communication. So is the airspace around us. Lightning flashed outside again, illuminating the cabin in cold white light. For a split second, the old man's face looked younger somehow. Harder. Like the storm had peeled back time itself. Reeves hesitated visibly. Every airline procedure he knew fought against the suggestion. But procedures were already collapsing one by one around them. The fighter jets outside were real. The navigation drift was real. And somehow this old passenger standing in the aisle knew every problem before the cockpit alarms announced them. Emily saw the exact moment Reeves made his decision. He nodded once. Tight. Reluctant. Come with me, he said quietly. Several passengers gasped as the cockpit door opened wider. The old man stepped forward without hurry, carrying the old leather duffel bag at his side. The faded patch brushed lightly against the cabin seats as he passed. GS6. The college kid who had mocked him earlier stared openly now, all arrogance gone from his face. Inside the cockpit, green instrument glow painted the walls in ghostly light. Rain hammered across the windshield in silver sheets, while warning indicators pulsed red across multiple displays. Captain Marcus Hale looked up sharply the moment he saw the old man enter behind Reeves. What is this? He snapped. Reeves answered quietly. Sir, I think he knows what is happening. The captain looked ready to argue until the old man's eyes drifted calmly across the instrument panel. One glance. That was all. Then he pointed toward the navigation display. Your magnetic drift is feeding false correction vectors. Silence filled the cockpit instantly. Captain Hale's expression changed. How the hell did you know that? The old man looked at the storm ahead through the windshield. Deep black clouds rolling endlessly beneath flashes of lightning. Then he spoke in the same low gravel voice. Because 30 years ago, I designed a workaround for it. The cockpit fell completely silent after the old man spoke. Rain hammered across the windshield in violent streaks, while warning lights reflected red against Captain Marcus Hale's stunned face. Outside the aircraft, lightning flashed through. The storm clouds in long white fractures that illuminated the nose of the Boeing for half a heartbeat at a time. The old man stood calmly between the two pilots, one hand resting lightly against the back of the cockpit jump seat, his faded olive jacket dark beneath the instrument glow. Captain Hale stared at him with open disbelief now. You designed the workaround? He repeated slowly. The old man nodded once. Back when aircraft still trusted pilots more than computers. Another burst of static exploded across the emergency frequency. Civilian aircraft, this is Falcon Lead. Your heading drift is now approaching military exclusion zone. Respond immediately. The younger fighter pilot sounded sharper now. Tighter. Emily Carter remained just outside the cockpit door, gripping the frame hard enough for her knuckles to pale white. The passengers behind her sat frozen beneath dim amber cabin lights, every face turned toward the cockpit in absolute silence. Captain Hale swallowed once and looked back toward his failing instruments. Navigation drift keeps multiplying every correction, he muttered. Autopilot cannot stabilize. The old man leaned slightly toward the center display. His eyes moved across the data with the smooth familiarity of someone reading an old language he had not forgotten. Your system is chasing false magnetic alignment through the storm front. Hale frowned. Then what do we do? The old man's answer came instantly. Stop trusting the digital reference. Both pilots looked at him at once. Reeves blinked first. You want us to fly manual? You are already flying manual, the old man said quietly. You just do not realize it yet. Another jolt shook the aircraft. The cockpit lights flickered again before stabilizing. Outside the windshield, a gray shadow tore past the clouds off the left side of the aircraft. Fast. Close. The roar followed a second later, like distant thunder rolling across steel. Falcon Lead was still there, watching them. Captain Hale rubbed a hand across his jaw, exhaustion finally visible beneath his professionalism. Even if I correct manually, we still need military clearance before we cross farther into restricted airspace. The old man looked toward the radio stack. Old memories moved silently behind his pale blue eyes. Open guard frequency. Hale hesitated. That channel is monitored by every military aircraft in range. Exactly. Reeves exchanged a glance with the captain. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Hale slowly reached toward the controls and switched frequencies. Instantly, the cockpit filled with low radio static layered beneath distant military chatter. Calm voices. Precise voices. The language of pilots who lived above clouds and trusted steel more than luck. The old man stepped closer to the microphone. Emily noticed something change in him then. His posture straightened slightly. His expression hardened almost invisibly beneath the years. Not arrogance. Familiarity. Like an old soldier hearing the sound of home after decades away. Captain Hale looked uncertain. "Sir, what exactly are you planning to say?" The old man rested one weathered hand lightly against the radio console. "Something they will recognize." Then he pressed the transmit switch. For one heartbeat, only static filled the cockpit. Rain hissed against the windshield. Engines roared beneath the aircraft. Every person aboard seemed to stop breathing at once. Then the old man spoke in a calm gravel voice that sounded older than the storm itself. Ghost 6 requesting vector confirmation. Silence slammed across the radio instantly. Not static. Silence. Complete and unnatural. Reeves slowly looked toward Captain Hale. Neither pilot moved. Outside the clouds, the distant roar of the fighter jets faded slightly, as though even they had paused. 5 seconds passed. Then 7. Emily could hear her own heartbeat. Finally, a young voice crackled over the frequency again. But the tone had changed completely now. Gone was the sharp military urgency. In its place was stunned disbelief. "Say again, did you just say Ghost 6? The old man never looked away from the storm ahead. "Affirmative." Another silence followed. Longer this time. Somewhere in the background of the transmission, new voices suddenly erupted across the military channel all at once. Overlapping. Confused. Shocked. Then a different voice entered the frequency. Older. Controlled. And very suddenly respectful. "Ghost 6, this is Falcon Lead." A pause. "Sir, is that really you?" No one inside the cockpit moved after the voice came through the radio. Rain hammered against the windshield in endless silver sheets while the storm clouds outside pulsed with distant lightning. Captain Marcus Hale sat frozen in his seat, one hand still resting on the throttle controls. First Officer Daniel Reeves stared openly at the old man standing beside the radio console as though the laws of reality had suddenly stopped working. Even the static over the guard frequency seemed quieter now. Then more voices exploded across the military channel at once. "Control, confirm that transmission. Did he say Ghost 6? That call sign is retired. No way that is real." The old man remained perfectly calm through all of it. One weathered hand rested against the edge of the cockpit panel while the green instrument glow reflected softly across the deep lines of his face. He looked neither proud nor surprised, only tired. Outside the storm clouds, 2 distant lights suddenly shifted position. Falcon Lead and his wingman were moving closer. Captain Hale finally found his voice. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The old man did not answer immediately. Another transmission crackled across the speakers. This time the fighter pilot's voice carried unmistakable respect beneath the professionalism. "Ghost 6, this is Falcon Lead. Requesting identity confirmation, sir." "Sir." Emily Carter felt the word hit the cockpit like a physical thing. Minutes ago they had treated the old man like a confused passenger wandering out of his seat during turbulence. Now United States Air Force fighter pilots were calling him sir over an emergency military channel. The old man leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Walter Hayes," he said calmly. "Retired colonel." Silence followed again. Then someone farther back on the frequency whispered something faint but audible through the static. "My God." Reeves blinked hard. The name had landed somewhere deep inside his memory now. Flight school lectures. Air combat history briefings. Stories. Older instructors still talked about with quiet reverence over black coffee at midnight simulators. Walter Hayes. Ghost 6. The pilot who had guided an entire stealth squadron home through electronic failure during Desert Storm after navigation systems collapsed inside a magnetic storm over the Gulf. Reeves slowly looked down at the faded patch stitched onto the old leather duffel bag. GS-6. It had been sitting under seat 16 the entire flight, like some forgotten piece of history nobody recognized anymore. Falcon Lead's voice returned carefully. "Sir, we were told you passed away years ago." A faint smile touched Walter Hayes's face for the first time. Small. Sad. A lot of people were. The cockpit remained silent except for the low roar of engines and distant radio chatter erupting across military frequencies now spreading far beyond the storm corridor. Somewhere out there, air traffic control centers, fighter squadrons, and command channels were all reacting to the same impossible transmission. Ghost 6 was alive. Captain Hale stared at Walter in disbelief. "You were telling me you were the Ghost 6. Walter looked out through the storm-dark windshield instead of answering directly. Lightning flashed across the clouds ahead, illuminating endless gray turbulence rolling beneath the aircraft nose. "Back then," he said quietly, "fighters still trusted voices more than computers." Reeves swallowed hard. "Sir, every military pilot in the country knows that call sign." Walter's eyes remained fixed on the storm. "That was a long time ago." Then the radio crackled sharply again. A new voice entered the frequency. Older. Command level. Calm in the dangerous way only experienced military officers sounded calm. "Ghost 6, this is Eastern Air Defense Command. Confirming positive identification request." Captain Hale straightened instantly at the authority in the voice. Emily felt cold run through her arms. This was no longer just a flight emergency. Somewhere beyond the clouds, entire military systems had begun reacting to one old man standing quietly inside a civilian cockpit. Walter reached toward the radio again. "This is Hayes," he answered. "Confirming." Several seconds passed. Then the command voice returned, and this time even the static could not hide the respect behind it. "Colonel Hayes, welcome back, sir." Outside the storm clouds, two gray shadows suddenly emerged from the darkness beside the Boeing. Close enough now for every passenger in the cabin to see them clearly through the windows. Two F-35 fighters flying perfectly alongside the civilian aircraft, their navigation lights glowing cold against the storm. And then, slowly, both fighters tilted their wings at exactly the same time in a formal aerial salute. The entire cabin watched in stunned silence as the two F-35 fighters held formation beside the Boeing through the storm. Their gray fuselages cut through the clouds like steel ghosts, navigation lights glowing cold red and white against the endless darkness outside. Every passenger pressed toward the windows now. Phones hung forgotten in trembling hands. Mouths slightly open. Even the crying child near the rear cabin had gone silent. Nobody aboard had ever seen military aircraft this close to a civilian flight before, and nobody understood why they were saluting one old man standing quietly inside the cockpit. Walter Hayes remained motionless beside the radio console. The green instrument glow reflected softly across his weathered face, while rain streaked endlessly across the windshield ahead. Captain Marcus Hale kept glancing between the storm, the fighter jets, and the old man as though his mind still could not fully connect them together. "I do not understand," Hale said quietly. "Why would they salute you?" Walter's eyes stayed fixed on the fighters outside. "Because they remember who trained them to survive storms like this." Another crackle rolled across the guard frequency. "Ghost 6, Falcon lead requesting permission to escort civilian aircraft through Corridor Bravo." The young pilot's voice carried absolute professionalism now, but underneath it was unmistakable awe. Walter reached toward the microphone calmly. "Permission granted, Falcon lead." Reeves stared at him. "They are asking you for permission?" Walter gave the faintest shrug. Military pilots respect chain of experience. Outside the left side of the aircraft, one of the F-35s shifted slightly closer, smooth and controlled despite the heavy turbulence shaking the storm corridor. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the sleek fighter for a split second so brightly that every passenger could clearly see the pilot's helmet turned toward the Boeing cockpit. Watching Ghost 6, Emily Carter felt goosebumps rise along her arms. She had worked hundreds of flights in her career. Turbulence, medical emergencies, delays, angry passengers. But this felt different. The atmosphere inside the aircraft had changed completely. Fear was still there, but something else had replaced the panic. Reverence, quiet and heavy, like everyone aboard suddenly realized they were standing near a piece of history they did not deserve to touch. The college kid who had mocked Walter earlier sat frozen near seat 18, staring out the window with pale eyes. His phone rested forgotten in his lap now. "That old guy," he whispered softly. "Who is he?" Nobody answered him, because nobody in the cabin really knew anymore. Another voice entered the military frequency. Female this time. Calm and official. Ghost 6. Eastern Air Defense confirms corrected vector path. Escort corridor is now secured for civilian aircraft. Walter acknowledged with a simple nod toward the microphone. No pride. No theatrics. Just the quiet confidence of someone who had spent an entire lifetime speaking through radios and storms. Captain Hale shook his head slowly. Sir, they are treating you like a living legend. Walter looked out into the clouds again. Legends are just old pilots who made it home. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Outside, the storm continued rolling endlessly around them, but the turbulence had softened now. The aircraft steadied beneath the escort formation. The two F-35s remained locked beside the Boeing like guardian shadows cutting through the night sky. Then Falcon Lead's voice returned one final time. Ghost 6, request permission for ceremonial pass. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Emily noticed the smallest flicker of emotion cross his face again. Old memories moving behind tired eyes. Men long gone. Voices buried beneath decades of silence. When he opened his eyes, he answered softly. Granted. The two fighters suddenly accelerated forward together, engines roaring through the clouds as they climbed slightly ahead of the Boeing nose. Then, perfectly synchronized, both aircraft rolled gently outward and dipped their wings once more in a flawless aerial salute before streaking ahead into the storm. Gasps filled the cabin behind them. One passenger quietly began crying. Captain Hale stared through the windshield in disbelief as the fighters vanished into the clouds ahead. Then the guard frequency crackled one last time. Falcon Lead's younger voice returned softer now, respectful in a way that felt almost personal. It was an honor flying with you tonight, sir. Walter Hayes rested one hand lightly against the old leather duffel bag beside him. The faded patch brushed beneath his fingers as he watched the empty storm clouds where the fighters had disappeared. Keep your nose above the weather, son, he said quietly. The sky gets unforgiving when you stop respecting it. By the time the Boeing finally broke free from the storm front, the cabin had become almost unnaturally quiet. The turbulence faded into a soft vibration beneath the aircraft floor, and the endless black clouds outside slowly gave way to scattered moonlight reflecting across the Atlantic far below. Passengers remained frozen in their seats as though nobody wanted to speak first and somehow ruin what they had just witnessed. The overhead lights returned to their normal dim blue glow, washing the cabin in tired silence. Walter Hayes stepped slowly back from the cockpit radio and picked up his old leather duffel bag. The faded patch brushed softly against his hand as he moved toward the cabin aisle again. No applause followed him. No cheering. Somehow that would have felt wrong. Instead, passengers simply watched in silence as the old man walked back toward seat 16 with the same calm posture he had carried since the beginning of the flight. Emily Carter followed him halfway down the aisle before finally finding the courage to speak. Colonel Hayes. Walter stopped briefly but did not turn around immediately. The title still sounded strange in her mouth after hours of calling him sir like any ordinary passenger. Yes, ma'am. Emily hesitated. There were 100 questions inside her mind now. Questions about the fighters, the storm, the call sign, the way military command voices had changed the moment they heard his name. But only one came out. Why did nobody know who you were? Walter looked down the quiet cabin for a moment before answering. Because the sky moves on faster than people do. Then he continued walking. Captain Marcus Hale stepped out from the cockpit a moment later. The hardened airline pilot who had spent the last hour fighting instruments and storm interference looked different now. Quieter. More humbled somehow. He walked directly toward Walter and stopped beside seat 16. Every nearby passenger watched closely. Hale stood there for one long second before extending his hand. It was an honor flying with you tonight, sir. Walter looked at the offered hand briefly, then shook it once. Firm. Respectful. You kept your passengers calm, Walter said softly. That matters more than fancy flying. Hale actually smiled at that. A small tired smile. The kind shared only between professionals who understood what pressure felt like at 30,000 feet. Near the aisle, the college kid who had mocked Walter earlier slowly stood from his seat. His face was pale with embarrassment. Sir, he began awkwardly. Walter looked toward him calmly. The young man swallowed hard. I am sorry for what I said earlier. Walter studied him for a moment, then gave a faint nod. Storms make people loud. The kid looked confused. Walter settled slowly back into seat 16 with a tired exhale. Experience teaches them quiet. Outside the windows, dawn had begun appearing faintly along the horizon. Thin silver lights stretched across the clouds far ahead like the edge of another world waiting for them. The rest of the flight passed in near silence. Nobody slept anymore. Some passengers watched Walter from a distance while pretending not to. Others simply stared out the windows, replaying the impossible night inside their minds. And through it all, Walter Hayes sat quietly beside the window with his old duffel bag resting against his boots, looking not like a hero or a legend, but simply an old pilot finally flying through calm skies again. When the aircraft finally touched down just after sunrise, another silence rolled through the cabin. Outside the terminal windows, several black military vehicles waited near the edge of the secured runway. Their dark silhouettes sat motionless beneath flashing amber lights. Emily noticed Captain Hale see them too. His expression shifted instantly. The plane taxied slowly toward the gate, while the passengers craned their necks toward the runway outside. Two Air Force officers stood waiting near the vehicles in dark blue dress uniforms. Perfect posture. Motionless. Waiting only for one passenger. Walter stood carefully as the seatbelt sign turned off. He picked up the old leather duffel bag and adjusted the faded olive jacket across his shoulders. Before stepping into the aisle, he paused beside the window one final time and looked out toward the pale morning sky above the runway. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Older now, slower, but still carrying the same quiet eyes that had once guided lost pilots home through storms. Then he gave the smallest nod to the empty sky outside and stepped forward without another word. Some call signs never leave the clouds.